Greetings and welcome. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I am the Deputy Director of the Latin American Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm the Director of our Argentina project, and I'm very glad to have you join us today. We often say that our topics are relevant and timely. I think no more so than a conversation about Argentina's debt crisis just hours before a potential default. It would be the 9th in Argentine history, which makes it feel familiar, but doesn't diminish the importance and potential consequences, both for Argentina's creditors and for the Argentine people. For that reason, it's important to offer not only the perspective that we've talked about before from the Argentine government, but also the perspective from private sector actors who have been engaging directly in negotiations with Argentina or following closely Argentina's negotiations over $65 billion of its foreign law debt. As I referenced, Argentina's deadline for paying a $500 million payment, which would trigger default if it were missed, is tomorrow. Today, Argentina continues in discussions to see if there's any possibility of avoiding default. A default for some in Argentina seems academic. The country's locked out of credit markets following capital flight and a debt crisis that predates the coronavirus pandemic. But in fact, the consequences would be quite severe. The country was headed toward a third consecutive year of recession anyway before COVID-19, but a default would reduce foreign investment, would raise borrowing costs should Argentina ever return to capital markets, would hurt Argentina's reputation, and could trigger a prolonged period of uncertainty and even litigation. The Argentine government, of course, has been emphasizing, understandably, the severe economic consequences and public health consequences of COVID-19. And indeed, though a lot of Argentina's problems, including its debt problems, predate this pandemic, Argentina is suffering greatly from the economic fallout of its aggressive public health measures. Latest projections are for a GDP decline that could exceed 8%. Again, this would be the third year of a recession and a much deeper one than the previous years. Poverty and unemployment were already rising and would rise much more rapidly. And even though the public health measures have been aggressive and have been widely acknowledged to have reduced the spread, Argentina continues to face a very grave public health risk, in part because of these very large, dense urban communities and informal settlements in and around the capital of Buenos Aires. In this context, Argentina, the IMF, and some private economists have rallied together to argue that the country deserves a significant haircut on the debt, and Argentina has asked for, in addition to a haircut on the principal, 3 years of delayed interest payments and a severe reduction in interest from its creditors. Nevertheless, the negotiations have been complicated, and Argentina finds itself with a very low participation rate in its one offer that it expressed to its creditors, and now finds it again facing a very dramatic deadline and face-off as it tries to avoid a disruptive default and a potentially long period that would disrupt economic activity and jeopardize a potential post-pandemic recovery. I'm gratified to have a group of interesting and, again, involved figures to discuss this, and the sponsorship of and participation of a principal in Explorador Capital, Andy Cummins, a friend and colleague who will moderate our conversation. He'll introduce for you all of our other panelists. He's a CEO and founder of Explorador, not only a sponsor of this event, but a great friend to our Latin American program here at the Wilson Center. Please return to our website after this event to find additional analysis on the impacts of COVID-19 throughout Latin America. We've been focusing on the economic impacts, the social impacts, impacts on women in particular and other vulnerable communities. As well, you'll find the recording of this event and other analysis. Let me not delay this important discussion any further, except to say that we will be accepting your questions as well. Please tweet us either in a direct message or tweet at us at LATAMProgram. That's at LATAMPROG. LATAMProg. We'll be monitoring that Twitter account throughout, and we'll be answering your questions at the end of our discussion. Andy, let me turn this over to you. Thank you, and to other panelists for joining us this morning, and thank you and our audience.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. We're all here on the eve of the end of a 30-day grace period for coupon payments for Argentina. We have with us today panelists to talk about where Argentina is and where things are going with respect to this debt restructuring. Mark Walker from Guggenheim Securities, Hans Humes from Greylock Capital, and Michael Papayannou, formerly of the IMF. All of their detailed bios are also on the website for more color on their background. But everyone on the panel today is deep in the weeds of this restructuring process. What I'd like to do to get started is to ask, where are we in this process? We're on the eve of a possible 9th sovereign debt default for Argentina. Maybe, Michael, you can get started and share your perspective on where we are.
Sure, Andy, and thank you. First, we should be given a general background. And before I start, I would like to say also that the remarks that I am going to be sharing with you do not reflect the fund's views. I am not an IMF staff, and the views, they are not on behalf of the fund. So with this usual disclaimer, I would like to start by saying that, number one, the emerging markets debt before the COVID-19 was already in a difficult situation. And this had been a difficult year, the 2019, for all the emerging markets debt due to the slowing global growth and the developments that we had subsequently with regards to commodity prices, which affected a number of countries and made their debt situation more difficult. Now COVID came and aggravated the whole situation for all countries, including the emerging markets, and in particular the low income and middle income countries. And of course, Argentina, that it is an emerging market. Now, as a second issue of the global background is that we had a realization of these adverse developments for the debt of the emerging markets, that after the COVID-19, we had the G20, the moratorium, the debt service suspension initiative for the IDA countries, the poorer countries of this world, that was agreed by the Paris Club. And it was acknowledging the fact that the debt situation for the poor countries, it is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to continue with a regular servicing of their debt, and something it had to be done. And we know that a term sheet, it came out, a number of countries, they showed interest for this initiative. Some others, they said that they will join. Some others, they said that they are considering, and some others that they said that they are not participating. Now, what does this mean? This means that this G20 initiative, that it has, as we said, that it has been agreed also by the Paris Club, it creates a positive environment for emerging markets debt. And this is having the international environment, the international community, showing that the challenges for emerging markets, the debt-related challenges, they are of a concern to everybody. Now, these two developments, I think that they are putting the prospects for the situation in Argentina. And I would like to mention a few things regarding the role of the IMF in Argentina. And as in all cases that the IMF is involved, the IMF tries to ensure that there is an economic program with the plans and the policies that they are accompanying a debt treatment, that the program is credible, that it helps restore sustainability, quick market reactions, and help restore especially the balance of payments and the international restructuring into a perspective of sustainability of the country. And the IMF's role in the Argentina case will not be different. Now, the final comment that I would like to share with you is regarding the Argentina's restructuring proposal and the counter proposals that we have seen from the creditors. And as you mentioned, and also Benjamin mentioned in the beginning, that we are in the eve of tomorrow's deadline. The important thing to note, and this is from the history that we have looked in sovereign debt restructurings, is we have been closely watching what it has happened in similar episodes since 1950, and we have seen that creditors in similar situations, the experience has shown that they are reasonable and they are coming always to some kind of a terms with the debtor countries, presupposing that we have a sustainable program, that we have debt sustainability that is there, and also that we have some kind of reasonable recovery values in terms of the proposals. And I think these are some of the views that we are going to be hearing from the other two speakers, that they are esteemed creditors and also international investors. Let me stop at this moment with this brief introduction to the case.
It seems that there is a standard sequencing of how these debt reprofilings take place, where first there's an economic plan put forth, then an IMF plan, and then a deal. And it doesn't seem that Argentina has followed that program. If not, why or why not? And very specifically, how much money might have been saved had Argentina put forth a credible program that would have then allowed for a lower exit yield if they'd gone the more orthodox path? Maybe Mark Walker, you can share your thoughts on that standard sequencing.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Andrew. I think, generally speaking, and there are no rules, of course, what countries have done when they needed to address a debt restructuring and deal with their private creditors as well as their official creditors is to begin by developing a coherent and comprehensive economic plan, to then interact with the IMF, reach agreement on a program that will support that plan, receive the IMF's imprimatur as to the economic plan itself, determine what assistance is available to the country from official sources and what will be required to support the implementation of the plan and ensure its success from private sources. For a number of reasons, some of which I think are more easily justifiable than others, some of which have to do with facts, some of which have to do perhaps with one's view of how to negotiate or one's view of the world, Argentina has followed what to me appears to be a different path. And there's one particular feature of Argentina's situation which is also different, and that is that going into this process, the IMF was already the largest single creditor of the country with $44 billion worth of exposure. And any restructuring plan and any economic plan had to incorporate provision for dealing with those with that obligation, and that had to be a part of the situation. I think the Minister Guzman had said early on that because of the dire condition of the Argentine economy, and this was before COVID, that it really wasn't possible in the immediate term to develop a comprehensive program, and it wasn't possible, he said, to estimate what the primary surplus or macroeconomic variables might look like going out some years in the future, and that it would take several years, or at least more than a year, before he could do that. And as a consequence, it wasn't possible to take the first step, which is to develop a plan, to interact with the IMF, to have an understanding as to what they would do, what they thought was necessary. And so he, and Hans and others know better than I, but he then approached creditors without that solid background that has always underlaid discussions in the past. At the same time, the minister had made it clear from his academic career that he thought that prior restructurings, not just for Argentina, but generally speaking, were unsuccessful because people were too optimistic. He produced data to show that within 5 years, many countries were back restructuring again or in default again, and was determined, so he said, to make sure that Argentina did not follow that path, but rather produced a program which would, to the extent possible, ensure that Argentina was not a recidivist and would not fall back into difficulty in the same brief time period. That approach, of course, leads to being particularly conservative. The more there's uncertainty in the future, and the more you want to protect yourself against uncertainty, the more you make assumptions as to worst case scenarios, and that leads to producing harsher restructuring, less market-friendly proposal. So I think that's kind of the, and that has, I think, inevitably had an impact on how discussions have begun. And there are other issues regarding negotiations, but in terms of sequencing, I think that's kind of a reasonable background.
Do you think Argentina would have saved money by obtaining a lower exit yield in the negotiations had they sequenced things with a plan first?
I think it's hard to reach that conclusion. I think the exit yield is going to be a function of how credible the plan is, confidence in the government, confidence that they will be able to perform whatever obligations they ultimately agree with the private creditors. I mean, there are certain costs perhaps from delay, but I don't think the exit yield is a function, frankly, of the sequencing.
Right, but you were basically saying if there was a plan that generated confidence, that would influence the deal people are willing to accept. And so in the absence of that, there must be some cost, no?
Yeah, but I don't think, I would have no way of trying to estimate or evaluate.
Let's talk a little bit more about the details, the nitty-gritty of the negotiation itself. You know, how do creditors grapple with that uncertainty of economic growth that Mark and I were talking about? Last time around, Argentina went for a very long time without access to capital markets, to credit markets during an protracted default. Does that give them leverage today? Also, the creditors have split into 3 groups over the last few months. Do you think they'll come back together now? We saw an article or a leak in the press that BlackRock had suggested that their group more closely align with the other creditors. Is that something that has merit, and meaning that the creditors are going to come together? Maybe we can go to Hans to hear his perspective on how the negotiations are evolving. And
sure. Well, listen, the leak to the press, or the press story about BlackRock, the BlackRock group, you know, considering lowering their offer, I think has to be taken in the context of any kind of negotiations, or especially stuff in Argentina where there are competing factions in the country and leaks that come out that benefit certain interest groups. I mean, if you think about it, the BlackRock group story, put in the context of the story that was coming around, somebody put out that Argentina was going to pay the $500 million tomorrow,
and that Guzman was going to get pushed out, and they had Guillermo Nielsen as the number one choice to replace him, and Emmanuel Álvarez Agis as the number two. That also, I think, was a leak or a story that was pushed out there to benefit some kind of interest group. So I would be a little cautious about stories about one group or another group folding. It certainly is in the interest of the Argentines to try to play one group against the other. But I think it's pretty clear, and I'm not, I need to be a little careful about what I say in this call, but if you look at the public statements of the three groups, there's quite a bit of coordination. We're at some level, we all have the same interest to get as good a recovery as possible within the framework that the countries put out and the implied framework that the IMF has put forward in terms of what's sustainable. So I don't think, despite these kind of stories floating out in the press, a divide and conquer strategy, I think it's they could continue to try it, but it's clearly not going to work. There's really no ability to split one group against the other. The nature of the three groups, I think it's sort of different interests. The BlackRock group represents sort of real money. The exchange bondholders, by their name, represents the exchange bonds that are that came out of the Kirchner 2005 to 2010 canjes, and then I think the ACC is sort of everybody else, more hedge funds and other mutual funds that are looking to sort of work through whatever process there is. So again, I suggest that the stories that were coming out yesterday, we'll probably continue to see other stories where different people within Buenos Aires sort of float things out to try to nudge things or influence stuff in a certain direction. And you should certainly, you certainly had some experience of how negotiations in Argentina go.
Tomorrow, thank you, Hans. Tomorrow, we have a deadline. If Argentina doesn't pay the coupons, they're in default. What happens next? Will they default? Will they go straight to court? How messy is this going to get? What do things look like Monday if there's no announced agreement between creditors and the government?
Listen, I think from the Argentina standpoint, I'm not sure that it's that big of a deal for them to go into default. I would think that, given Minister Guzman's statements over the last few days about being involved in negotiations and good feedback from the creditors, creditors all put forward proposals that were within some sort of framework of reasonableness. I don't think that there's a high likelihood that you'll see very broad-based litigation coming out at this stage, because the biggest holders are either directly or indirectly involved in discussions. The impact, I think, will be felt less by Argentina, where, okay, they're in default again. It's happened before. Just what happens to CBS. I'm pretty sure that there's quite a bit of CDS that's been written, and we could see a short-term distortion in the secondary markets as those transactions get, when there's, when the CDS is announced and it's triggered. But that remains to be seen. I don't think we can necessarily predict what might happen in the markets. But I think that's where we're going to see the impact much more than necessarily on Argentina within the next few weeks. If the default lasts for months, then we might see some legal proceedings kick up.
And then you've been through, Hans, a number of debt restructurings. In fact, your fund specializes in sovereign restructuring. So you've got a particularly unique perspective on this. Argentina has launched a bit of a charm offensive, rallying support with a letter from, dozens, if not more, more than 100 economists sort of supporting their case, engaging the Pope, who maybe is a little biased because he's originally from Argentina, but the Pope as well. Does that influence this at all? Do creditors care? What's the importance of that? Have you seen that before in sovereign debt negotiations?
Not at this level, and honestly, it'd have a tremendous impact if those economists, academics, and the Pope were truly creditors.
It got distorted. Could you say that again?
It would have a tremendous impact if those economists and academics and the Pope were really, really large bondholders. And then they could accept the terms, and then there might be some momentum in the deal. But as it stood, the acceptance rate was well below 20%. We listened to described by Michael's fund, by these economists, in terms of needing some kind of cash relief in the short term. I think, creditors, if you see the proposals that were offered, understand that that is a necessity and are willing to accommodate it. But I think that the issue, the overall recovery scenario based on the longer dated coupons isn't really, I think the creditors feel that there is better paying capacity if you, if there is growth in the economy in the future, there needs to be a way that Argentina can service its debt at a higher coupon level. And that's, I think, where the disagreement goes. So fitting within the framework of what the IMF put forward and what Martin Guzman put forward, there should be enough flexibility to get to a deal that's acceptable, but we'll have to see.
I'd like to talk a little bit about longer term macroeconomic growth prospects, but before we turn to that topic, could you make a couple of comments on what's been a turnoff for the creditors in terms of this whole process? I guess let me frame it this way. What advice would you give to the government of Argentina to have reached a smoother and more successful reprofiling of the debt, either in terms of process or content?
I think at this stage, I'd have to say that that's their job, not my job. Every finance minister, economy minister, president or prime minister of a country will choose their own route. And, we haven't seen a catastrophic impact. The path they've chosen is not one that is blocked any kind of engagement. In fact, they've at least taken the steps to open up, make themselves accessible, share information and their thoughts on stuff. So, sort of advice I would give on strategy and tactics, that's their job, not mine. So, we do our side, they do their side, and we'll see what happens.
Right. Great. Thanks, Hans. Thinking a little bit about, before Argentina started this process, Argentina was already in a recession for the last 2 years. They had high inflation. It's going to be as high this year as it was last year. It's exacerbated by the COVID and the lockdown. Avoiding a protracted default and litigation is certainly going to be a positive if the government and the creditors can come together. But what position is Argentina in after resolving this? Maybe we can hear from you, Michael, on thoughts about Argentina's growth prospects on the other side of some kind of agreement to reprofile here. You're on mute, I think you need.
Certainly. The important thing to understand is, first of all, a restructuring is not a panacea for any country. And secondly, we should be understanding also that any kind of a default is very costly. And it's costly for the country, it's costly for all of them involved, including the creditors. Mostly because of the time that it takes for litigating and all of the other issues in protracted discussions and negotiations. So there is, I think, a very good case that the country, the authorities, the international investors, the creditors, everybody is going to be looking for a solution that it is going to be avoiding extremes. Now, if we are going to be going along this kind of an approach, I think if we are having a solution, the prospects for an increased investment in the country, market access, if it's going to be continuing, these are going to be very positive effects for the growth prospects of Argentina. Underline also some of the problems that we discussed, and these are the issues with the longer-term growth. They need, of course, a program, and this program, of course, it is going to be something that it needs to be related to whatever kind of a debt treatment we are going to be. And that's why it is important that this program, it is going to be based on realistic assumptions for growth, for debt sustainability, for restoring the financial stability of the country, including the exchange rate and also the inflation, and also having some kind of reasonable level of reserves. So if we are going to be seeing some kind of a solution into the current situation, we are going to be having some a restoration of some of the confidence from the international community, more, as we said, positive effects on growth and also on the financing and the financing gap and the debt sustainability that we are looking for, and also for the exchange rates, that all of these kind of factors, they are going to be restoring international confidence, and it is going to be stabilizing the exchange rate and inflation, which are very important components for longer-term prospects of the country.
Mark, do you have any thoughts on the economic growth outlook of Argentina and how that is affecting creditors' perspective on the negotiation?
Of course it affects, because the question of confidence in the country and its ability to honor its obligations is critical, and a critical element of any negotiation and of what is acceptable to creditors. The creditors in Argentina have shared interest in the prosperity of the country. There's no question about that. Today their interests diverge because Argentina would like to pay less, would like to have more room. Creditors would obviously like to recover more. That's obvious. But that's not at the very heart of what's going on. And I think ultimately the debt restructuring is not quite a sideshow, but it isn't what brings us to the successful conclusion. At the end of the day, if Argentina is going to grow and attract investment, it's because it has sound policies. It's because whatever it borrows or the products of investment are in fact put to productive use. Argentina doesn't earn enough foreign exchange to service its debt. But the answer to that isn't to say simply, well, then just cut the debt. The answer is obviously to fix the economy. So I think the debt restructuring sets the stage. It allows things to go forward. But at the end of the day, success depends on economic policy, not the restructuring.
Thank you. At the beginning of the presentation, we asked our audience to submit questions via Twitter at LATAM Prague. And we've had some questions coming in. Let's hear those questions from Benjamin, who's been monitoring the Twitter account, and bring those questions to our panelists.
Excellent. So a couple of questions relevant to, Hans, some of the broader context to these negotiations. Andy's reference, Joseph Stiglitz and the Pope weighing in. There's also, we talked about earlier, we heard from Michael of debt questions that the G20 has been grappling with, the Paris Club, the IMF. The idea that in this moment, creditors are facing a lot of pressure, both official and private creditors, to be more flexible than maybe in other circumstances. The questions for you kind of go to this issue is whether, is that context relevant in the actual negotiating room? Meaning when creditors are sitting with Argentina, are they having to weigh the broader international context of COVID-19 and so many debtors turning to creditors and asking for unusual flexibility? How, if at all, is that a factor in your and other creditors' approach to Argentina?
It's a tremendous factor, and just in broad terms, it's unlikely that the offers that Argentina received from the creditor group would be at the levels that they were if we weren't in the midst of a pandemic. Specifically to the G20 and the Paris Club efforts, the DSSI, the sustainability or initiative or standstill initiative, it's something that all creditors are aware of with these countries, and I think that towards that outreach from the official sector, we've actually put together a group of creditors, quite a large group in fact, to address this issue directly with finance ministers of some of the poorer countries, and respond to some of the outreach from the official sector on this. I think, in short terms, the private sector, all you need to do is look at the case of Ecuador to see how responsive the private sector can be on this. Ecuador reached out to its largest creditors, asked for a standstill, and received it in far, far less time, in a fraction of time than it took for the official sector to get into its sort of second stage of discussions on how to formulate policy on this. You get other countries that, until relatively recently were not so prosperous, like Paraguay, that have been able to tap the markets and were able to access the bridge financing they need to get through the crisis. So in broad terms, there's an understanding that this pandemic has had a dramatic impact on economies of developing countries, and that there needs to be a bridge in some fashion. Again, we've seen record issuance in EM countries that have market access to be able to bridge the financial needs they have through the pandemic. And those countries that aren't able to do it, like Ecuador, have been able to get standstill agreements as a matter of course. The issue, I think, with coming up with broad-based, one-size-fits-all policy is that countries, I think, are now aware that if they try to do something like this, they do have the issue of the rating agencies seeing, something that looks like it might not be a voluntary, action on the part of creditors. And if a country gets downgraded by doing some sort of a standstill without engaging the creditors, and they get downgraded, we could come out the other side of this pandemic with countries that had market access that currently don't. And you don't have to look really much further than the HIPAA initiative, where comparability of treatment was implemented, and very, very few of those the countries that took advantage of that program were able to tap markets in the aftermath. So the end result is, many countries are unable to shake. Michael may not agree with me on some of this, but are not able to break out of being, within the custody of the official sector, and they're not able to finance at the kind of rates or at the kind of size that you can get from the private sector. So again, the overall initiative, we're aware of it. We're aware of the issues when the pandemic started. We've gotten creditors together to address this. And then in the context of Argentina, yes, of course, we're well aware of the financial impact of COVID on the global economy and its impact on Argentina. And I think that's why creditors are willing to be much more flexible than they were prior to the breakout of the pandemic.
Hans, a quick follow-up, and then I want to turn to Mark and Michael, which is, questions related to, well, what's different with Argentina, which we get, on any number of topics. But here, you've mentioned countries have been able to borrow again, Peru with a massive debt issuance. Other countries in the region have already turned to the IMF and received additional support. You've pointed out that, Ecuador was able to negotiate a standstill to avoid default as it negotiates with its debt. So what is different about Argentina? And I'll posit a few hypotheses, but you tell me, is it its history and sort of bad blood between creditors and the country? Is it its history of default and so the sort of lack of credibility that a restructured bond will be serviced? Is it its tactics in the negotiations, a perception of a take it or leave it offer that wasn't consensual and so didn't attract a lot of support? So why is Argentina so different in this outcome? And again, history, its current approach, negotiations, why can't it, receive the standstill that Ecuador negotiated or something comparable?
Listen, in terms of, it would have been interesting. I think Argentina and their finance people in the government were approaching this as an issue that needed to be resolved. So when they were already well underway in terms of coming up with sort of a macroeconomic projections, engaging with the official sector. So when the pandemic hit, they'd already done quite a bit of work, and I would imagine that they may have had some internal discussions. Maybe let's just put this off until we get some clarity. But given the amount of time and effort they'd already put into engaging with us, you have to remember we were having, a number of us went down to Argentina right before the outbreak to engage in direct discussion. So the choice of not asking for a standstill, again, that's, it's understandable in the context. I think in this current go-around, you have to look at I don't want to delve too much into prior actions or anything like that, because the most impactful, running into this election, the reason that I think, the Fernández coalition was able to prevail, it was because of the economic problems that the country was having. Some may have been just implementation of policy by the Macri administration, but they also had that incredible drought. So Argentina came into, this new administration with a pretty high debt level, an economy that was really on its heels, and a crisis of confidence on the street. I think that more than any of the actions that they've taken in this process or anything in the past really is pushing the necessity of engaging, and provides a lot of the strains in terms of the discussions, because we as creditors will look to those periods of growth that the country has had. Many of the people who are in charge of policy are looking at the periods of recession, depression that they've been going through. And the question is, when we come out the other side, obviously, I think the biggest driver on the growth potential for Argentina is what happens in the global economy. Argentina is not a big enough economy to survive on its own. They're going to be incredibly influenced by, if 9 months, 12 months from now we're in the midst of a global depression, they'll have the breathing room. If we come to an accord, they'll have the breathing room for the next few years. But if we're looking at a Great Depression, which I don't think we're going to have, I'm not sure what economic policies they can implement to really create growth. Now, if we do bounce back in economic activity, global demand starts picking up again, and you get the kind of trade so they can export their agricultural commodities, I think they have quite a bit of potential for growth. And that's, I think, what creditors are looking to guide this towards, is leave it in this, if we go first and then the IMF goes first, we have to be optimistic, goes afterward, we have to be optimistic that what they're managing gives them enough latitude to implement the correct policies, and with the recovery in the global economy, that they can start growing and servicing the debt that they commit to through these negotiations. We'll see.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let me remind everyone to continue sending us questions through Twitter. We are the Latin American Program at LATAMPROG. That's LATAMPROG. Andy, I think you've received a question, so go ahead.
Thanks, Benjamin. There's still confusion in the market about what actually is at stake with respect to the impact of default. And I do, when we wind up, I want to take a survey of the panelists of what's the likelihood that we will reach a deal in the next 30 days and be able to move on to some of these challenges that are being highlighted. But if we don't, so start thinking about your answers there, panelists. But if we don't reach an agreement and there is a default and it lasts for quarters or years, what does that look like for Argentina? What specifically happens? Can a corporation still borrow money if the sovereign can't? Maybe Michael, you could unmute and share some of your thoughts about just exactly what's at stake economically for Argentina if no deal is met over the next 3 to 18 months.
First of all, as mentioned earlier, defaults are not the ideal situation for any kind of a situation, for any kind of country. So I am hoping that the situation is not going to be ending in a default, and at the worst case to have a protracted type of a resolution process from the default. Now, in case that we go into this unfortunate event, because again, I would like to stress that defaults are very costly for everybody. The important thing is that the country, it has lost market access. The country does not have any kind of a reliance from the external situation, from the external sector to finance any kind of economic activities. And this is not only the government. These are the activities from the banks. These are the activities of the corporations. So everybody is affected by this kind of a situation that it has to do with default. Now, the other issue that it also is relevant, what are the costs of a default? They have to do with the internal also confidence in the country. And we have seen that trade and economic activity in countries that they are in default, they have experienced a significant drop in economic activity. And also we see that the situation, it is all in some cases, it goes also to political instability and social unrest. And that's, in a nutshell, some of the issues that we are facing when we have defaults. And again, from the international experience. And no matter how, what kind of policies that the government is going to be instituting after a default, this kind of scars that you're getting from the loss of market access and the internal instability, they are the prominent factors that they are determining the life of the country, the life of the people of the country that they are undergoing a default.
Thanks, thanks, Michael. The letter that was sent by over 100 economists supporting Argentina's position on the debt relief focused a lot on the need for support exacerbated by the COVID virus and the global economic response. It didn't talk at all. I mean, Hans, you talked a little bit about wanting those folks to have skin in the game. I also thought it was interesting that they didn't make any reference as to how we got here in the first place, which is fiscal irresponsibility and fiscal deficit. And I wanted to turn to Mark Walker and ask, you know, his thoughts. Can Argentina ever balance its budget? Is there something wrong with the country that they need to keep spending more than they bring in, building up, financing it with debt, and then being a serial defaulter? I mean, why was that not addressed in the letter from the economists that were asking for relief, also calling for responsibility by the country and its politicians and its voters?
Well, I can't really address why some things were included and some things were not included in the letter. But look, I think there are many people, and they include some of the signatories to the letter, who for years have felt strongly and expressed strong views that countries should be relieved of the heavy burden of indebtedness. I've worked with many of them when in my capacity as advising countries, and they tend. Some of these are serious people. They know that what needs to be done for a country to have good pro-growth policies, but in their minds, I think they separate the issues out, and they feel that from a political standpoint, it's important to give countries space to allow them to grow, and they focus on that and I think they must feel, and it's probably true, that the message would be diluted if on one hand they come out and say, look, you have to give these countries room, you have to write off the debt. On the other hand, say, but of course the countries have to do a better job and regain confidence on their own. That's the way I would imagine it, but I don't really know what prompts them to say one thing or another. Let me say on the question.
Does it surprise you that they didn't reference it? I know you don't know why they wouldn't, but
no, it doesn't. It doesn't surprise me, frankly, because I've worked with many of these people for a long time, and I think, look, the purpose of the letter was not to give policy advice. The purpose of the letter was to try to generate support for a negotiating position that they presumably supported. Try to generate support for the rather strong restructuring proposition that was put forward by the government. If that's what you're trying to do, you don't dilute that message by saying, and by the way, government, you need to do what you need to do. I think they assumed that was, the government had already said they were going to do what they're going to do, right? Martin Guzman has said that he wants to have cohesive, coherent policies going forward. He's commented that all the money that was borrowed by Macri was not used, or none of the money that was borrowed by Macri was used for productive investment to do the kinds of things that Hans referred to. So I think the messages was delivered from a particular perspective. If you ask those same economists what policy advice they would give to the government, they would say something different. But that wasn't the intent or the purpose, I think, of the message.
Thanks, Mark. So we're coming up to the top of the hour, and we're going to be winding up our webinar conversation. I gave you a hint of the closing survey that I'm going to ask. Maybe we can go to Hans first. Are we going to have a deal in the next 30 days?
I don't think I should answer that.
Okay.
I would echo what Michael said, that nobody involved in this process would be well served by a hard default. And if there's room for a compromise of some sort, that would be in everybody's interest. I think that all the large creditors understand that coming up with a resolution at this point is in their interest. I think the country understands it's in their interest as well. And certainly I think the IMF would prefer there not to be a hard default with the private creditors. Now, I think it's going to be very difficult to avoid some sort of default, but it's very different if you can come up with some way to cure the default in short order after the actual incident. But especially in this environment, I'm a little concerned about, and I think that most governments are concerned that if the bottom falls out of the Argentine economy, and given the unpredictability of the pandemic, what is the potential collateral damage? What could be the contagion of something disorderly coming in the next few months out of Argentina? And I would hate to see something as disorderly as a hard default. So, instead of giving you a probability assessment, I think I would just like to convey a broad desire that something constructive comes out of this, just as a human being, as well as a creditor.
So you're saying creditors have a heart too?
Listen, I can only speak for myself. I do not want to see, I was afraid that you're going to ask me the question about what might happen if it gets disorderly. And I was just going to say, I'd prefer not to find out.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that the stakes are high and the incentives are aligned among the creditors and the government and the people of Argentina to reach resolution in a constructive way and put this behind them. Mark and Michael, do you want to venture a guess as to whether we have a deal or not in the next 2 to 4 weeks?
I don't think I can predict that, but one way or the other. But look, I think, first of all, the fact that there will be a default once the grace period expires in a day is not, it has some psychological import, but not much beyond that. It's not going to be followed by litigation the day after tomorrow or next week. What would be the purpose of that? People can accelerate their debt if they want, but it doesn't do anything. Everyone's at the table already. And those creditors who have a propensity for litigation have seen in Argentina itself, as well as elsewhere, that you can litigate for a decade, spend millions of dollars in expenses, and collect nothing. So I think the real issue is not litigation. The real issue is disruption. I agree with Hans that it is clearly in everybody's interest to avoid a disorderly default. I've been working extremely closely with many of the African countries on DSSI and engaging with creditors in that context. There are market considerations. I think despite the divergence of interest, creditors are in fact committed to doing what they can to help countries recover, because frankly, it's in their interest as well. But, at the end of the day, the government in Argentina has to decide at what point they can change their position and still believe that they can achieve their policy goals. And the creditors have to decide at what point they think they are better off with a deal that is not to their liking, or not as much their liking as they would like, than otherwise. And as Hans said, nobody benefits from a messy default. Nobody benefits at all, and it will be a bad precedent for the world. So all I would say is that I'm hopeful that there will be a resolution in the next in the near term, but not having participated in the discussions, I can't really predict.
Thank you. Michael, any 30 seconds for you?
I am also not able in order to be predicting what is going on, but I would like to see this situation again from the longer term perspective, and the question that you asked, what are the prospects and how we can improve the prospects. And we mentioned that we have the authorities that they should be following prudent economic management. I would say also that we need to see the future of debt in terms of domestic market development. And this requires debt management policies that they are going to be moving in that direction. And the third thing that I believe that it is important based on the whole situation is that the countries that they are involved in external borrowing, they should have strong investor communication strategies, and also they should be moving in the direction of finding solutions rather than making aggravated kind of proposals.
Thank you. I want to thank all the panelists. While nobody answered my final question, I'm going to venture to answer my own question and say that when you have a case of all the parties in a room having aligned interest to get something done, it usually eventually gets done. And I would add that in the context that we're discussing, it's 17% of GDP, and that excluding intra-agency and intra-country debt and looking at long-term real exchange rates, the debt is much more manageable and the bid-ask is now more narrowed. I think my guess is that we are going to get a deal, but that's just one person's speculation.
Excellent.
Let me turn it over to Benjamin, and I want to thank all the panelists today for participation.
And I do as well. And I want to thank you, Andy. I want to thank Explorador for sponsorship of this event, for your excellent moderation. Hans, Michael, Mark, thank you for sharing your insights. The interest is huge in the subject, and it's because it's so consequential, as I think came out of this conversation very clearly, not only for creditors and Hans and you and your colleagues who are negotiating, but obviously for the Argentine government, for the Argentine people, where this is not an academic conversation, but a question really about their livelihoods, their quality of life, and the Argentine economy, its ability to work its way through this pandemic and to, on the other side, find some sort of debt sustainability and some ability to restart growth. So there's a lot at stake here. It's a complex and consequential issue. And I think, this has been monumentally helpful for us and for others who are following this day to day, hour by hour, to understand both what's at stake, why it has been so difficult to come to an agreement, what would occur if an agreement is not reached, and how can Argentina more productively engage with creditors and, again, come out on the other side and find growth, reduce poverty, and improve the quality of life for all Argentines. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching and engaging. The full recording of this webcast will be available in short order on our website at wilsoncenter.org/LAP for Latin American Program. So you can find the full recording if you're unable to see any portion of it. And we're happy to hear your ideas for future coverage of this issue and other impacts of the COVID-19 in Latin America. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and stay in touch, stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.